Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Good, Eric. How you doing?
Good, good. We got to stop meeting like this, but it's actually worked out fairly well.
I know. I think I'm seeing you, more virtually in person than we have previously. So it's not all
Probably.
bad with the pandemic, right?
Right, right, exactly. So, encoding.com, obviously, encoding.com has been around for a long time, and you've powered many cloud-based transcoding workflows for streaming services, OTT content distributors, broadcasters. But today you're going to be talking about using the cloud to power content processing for broadcast or B2B. So my first question is, can you describe what a typical content processing workflow might look like for direct to consumer distribution, like streaming services or mobile apps, versus a broadcast or B2B distribution situation?
Sure. Yeah. I'd be happy to. And I do want to start out by just saying that this is a tech talk, but I am in no way a video engineer, and I have much smarter people who I work with. So at the end of the talk, if anyone has deep technical questions, please feel free to reach out to either me at jeff@encoding.com or sales@encoding.com, and we'll route it to the appropriate, much smarter person. To answer your question, Eric, sure. So, a typical direct-to-consumer content pipeline, you start with a source video format, and that will typically be a high resolution, high bit rate J2K file or H.264 in an MXF, or more often than not, a ProRes file. And we will be transcoding and packaging that into adaptive bitrate packages for delivery to your iPads, your Apple TVs, etc. All the OTT destinations, and it'll be packages for HLS and Dash with multiple bitrate renditions in each package. And then in that process, in that pipeline, we'll ingest the content. We will most likely work with captions and subtitles, where we'll have to extract or convert them from the source format to the output formats that are required. We'll be working with DRM encryption in multiple frameworks. We will be injecting triggers for dynamic ad insertion. And then at the end of that process, before delivery, we'll run it through a QC cycle, where we're not only looking at checks for audio and video quality, but also actually the manifests for the adaptive bitrate delivery itself. However, for broadcast pipelines, which I'm going to focus on with our talk today, it's even more complex than that. And as you mentioned, the broadcast pipelines have typically been processed on-premise infrastructure. And only recently, in the last year or two, have we been helping companies migrate their broadcast pipelines to the cloud. The broadcast pipeline, the source formats won't be too dissimilar from direct to consumer, but you work more with camera formats, XD-Cam or DNX HD, and there'll also be J2K and a lot of ProRes. And we will be transcoding into, in the US, it's a lot of MPEG-2 package for cable labs or XAVC, outputs. But really where the differentiators occur between D2C and broadcast pipelines are all those features that are required in the middle. So for a broadcast pipeline, once you ingest the source content, you run it through a conformance process where you're basically making sure and validating that everything you're supposed to receive, you are receiving. You will package it for cable labs in the US compliance, for not always, but oftentimes. We will be injecting a Nielsen SID-TIC watermark, right? Which we're all aware of. There'll be automated assembly features for trimming tops and tails, or injecting black frames or removing black frames, that kind of stuff. And at the end of this process, of course, we're going to run it through a rigorous QC cycle. But the QC cycle is even more complex because you're also making sure that the videos are either compliant for cable labs, which is very rigorous, or for specific hardware requirements like set-top boxes, which can be also very rigorous. So that's basically the description of the two pipelines.
Okay. As you said, broadcast workflows have typically been managed on-prem using dedicated appliances. It's funny. I think those of us who are streaming native when we go to trade shows. Remember that when we, you'd go to trade shows like IBC, and there would still be a lot of talk about, oh, wow, we got to move to the cloud. And I think some of us from the streaming side of things were saying, well, we've always been there, right? So this is
Right.
still relatively
Yeah.
new, and for a number of reasons that you've talked about, and that you'll continue to talk about. Broadcasters are finally migrating those workflows to the cloud.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
are some of the key challenges that they face when migrating and operating these broadcast workflows or the transcoding pipelines in the cloud?
Well, there are quite a few, first and foremost, and one of the reasons that it's been taken this long to finally get to the point where we're migrating these workflows to the cloud are the massive files, right? So we're working with camera formats, raw formats, even RED sometimes, J2K, ProRes, etc. Average source file size can be up to 250 gigabytes. So, working with very large files is a big challenge. In the US, and not everyone, but working with Cable Labs compliance, it's a very rigorous set of requirements. And packaging for Cable Labs in the cloud can be tricky in and of itself because, as we're talking about, these workflows have traditionally been run on-prem. And so there aren't these off-the-shelf tools that are, that you could just plug into a cloud workflow for Cable Labs compliance. So you need to build some, stitch together some different engines and packagers or build your own, etc. Working with Nielsen in the cloud, when we first started talking to Nielsen about this, they had still had a hardware dongle requirement on their SIDTIC servers. Obviously, not very virtual cloud friendly. So it's working with Nielsen. Speed is a critical challenge, and a job turnaround time. If you have a live event and then you want to make that content available for VOD quickly as possible right after the event, or your news that you want to publish very quickly, etc. So speed is a challenge, and in the cloud, working with captions, especially for broadcast and Cable Labs compliance, can be very tricky again because the open source tools that aren't and commercial tools, frankly, aren't readily available for cloud workflows, right? So sometimes you're creating your own, as I'm going to talk about that we had to in some cases. Working with complex audio and conformance assembly is very challenging in broadcast workflows. In audio, for example, the source content can be coming from different locations, even satellite. It's often missing critical audio data, or it's very varied in the number of audio tracks and the channels. You're dealing with different codecs. So first you're conforming it, and then you're working with multi-track audio and languages. So that's complex. And I think that, another challenge that has to be resolved is around the automated QC, because again, these workflows have traditionally been run in on-prem environments, and tools like Baton, which many of the large media and entertainment companies utilize, a fantastic tool for running automated QC in an on-prem environment. Again, in the cloud, these tools aren't necessarily readily available.
All right. So to address all of these challenges, what are some of the tools and capabilities that Encoding.com has now added to its platform that supports these broadcast pipelines?
Yeah, I wanted to make this talk not just all about Encoding.com, and
right.
These are solutions whether Encoding.com has developed or implemented, or others will need to address if they utilize their own or a different vendor or whatnot. ProRes is a critical format in broadcast or B2B pipelines. It's very popular with large media and entertainment companies. So we worked with Apple and developed a 64-bit Linux Apple ProRes library, or using the 64-bit Apple Linux ProRes library for the ability to encode and decode all ProRes flavors in the cloud. It was a long and rigorous process to become Apple certified and fully licensed, et cetera. So that's a critical solution. Developing a solution for Cable Labs compliance. Again, there isn't an easy off-the-shelf solution that runs in the cloud. We ended up using a specific packager that frankly isn't commercially available anymore. We have to support various camera codecs and formats. You can use a main concepts engine or something else. Working with Nielsen, as mentioned, we had to, Nielsen does have an SDK that we implemented and helped a couple of years ago convince them to remove the dongle requirement. But you do have to go through another rigorous compliance process with Nielsen to become Nielsen certified. We did develop a suite of tools for conformance and assembly. Really on the conformance, you really want to validate that the frame size and the bit rates and the colorimetry are all what you expect it to be. So you need some tools to be able to check that. And then on the assembly side, it's the ability to really to take in instructions like an edit decision list, an EDL in an automated fashion. And these instructions will, to trim the top and tails off our video, remove advertisements, insert black frames, remove black frames, these kind of stitch videos together. So these are all expected from what are traditionally done in on-prem workflows. For automated QC, interesting for us coming out of, as you mentioned earlier, sort of more of the D2C world, we ended up developing our own comprehensive suite of QC features specific to direct to consumer delivery. So audio and video quality checks and manifest checks. But, again, for broadcast, there's more rigorous tests required. So we ended up partnering with Intera Systems and implementing Bait and Node into our cloud-based workflow. So now customers who are used to working with Bait in an on-prem environment now have the ability to do the same in a cloud environment. Captions has been more complex than I ever would have imagined. And it really, again, comes down to the fact that OSS tools are open source tools for the conversions of various formats to required formats where you're extracting captions, converting them, muxing them, or embedding them back in, aren't readily available for a cloud environment. So we ended up developing our own proprietary solution for converting MCC captions to SCC. And to address speed, again, we have this thing called that we launched a feature set we call ludicrous mode. We borrowed that from Spaceballs, not Tesla, I think. Yep. I think Greg, my partner, came up with that, so I have to ask him. So anyway, ludicrous mode we developed initially for the streaming, for direct to consumer, where it's basically our version of parallel chunk processing. You ingest a source content, you segment into lots of different small pieces, you transcode all those pieces in parallel, and you stitch it back together, thus accelerating the transcoding times. However, for broadcast, when you're dealing with camera codecs and formats, it becomes a lot more complex. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and really develop a whole new suite of solutions for ludicrous mode, which we now have done. And the great news is, as I mentioned earlier, you're talking about 250 gigabyte source files that are very dense. Typical runtime processing might take, 2.5 times the length of the video. With ludicrous mode for broadcast, we're now doing it in about half of real time or half of runtime. So we're pretty excited by that. And then again, on the automated QC, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's on there twice. We talked about adding Baton Node. So these are some of the solutions that we've added to support broadcast pipelines.
Well, and I like the fact that you preface that by saying, yes, you're here talking about encoding.com, but these are all of the challenges that anyone who is trying to migrate broadcast B2B workflows to the cloud are going to have to address, and gave some thoughts on what it takes to address them. But getting back to encoding.com more specifically, you've got some very big name marquee customers for your media processing, your video processing workflows, customers like Warner Media, HBO, Peacock, NBC, Fox. In order to serve companies like that and keep them as customers, what's required for you to be successful? In other words, why do they keep using encoding.com, and why are they migrating some of these broadcast pipelines to the encoding.com platform?
Yeah, I mean, other than having to give up my firstborn child,
Right.
There are some keys to success, and I'm basically I thought about what can I share that obviously it's from my experience with encoding.com, but what could be relevant to others out there, and first and foremost, and my partner Greg and I talk about this quite a bit, is a focus. In our case, it's 100% focusing on VOD transcoding pipelines in the cloud, right? We're not in the business of creating players, providing analytics, or doing live transcoding, and there are other vendors who do that incredibly well. We thought, what can we be the best in the world at? And hopefully we're achieving that. And that's really so VOD pipelines in the cloud, because in the case of these pipelines, you're talking about a myriad of video formats, audio formats, caption formats, DRM frameworks, et cetera, and it's an ever-changing landscape. And the components that make up that workflow are not only transcoding, it's the DRM and the DAI and the caption conversion, et cetera. So having that focus on whatever it is you're doing in the components that make up the workflow, I think is critical. Being nimble has been very important. And what I mean by that is that we have a pretty robust platform or a large comprehensive feature set across all these components that, for the more complex workflows, we say that makes up about 97% of the requirements, the customer requirements. But there's always that last mile 3% that has to get developed. So it's having a process and an architecture that you can quickly add and implement new features. So we run today about 47, 48 different processing engines underneath the hood, underneath our API. And when we need to add new features, we have a system now in place where we could find an engine, add that engine, expose those features via the API very quickly to our customers. So they're only modifying their job payload or their XML or JSON to our platform to utilize. So I think, that's a critical component. And then finally, experience, right? And this one's a hard one, because you have to go out and get it, right? There's only one way to get experience, is just to go out and do it. But when thinking about, who to partner with, what kind of vendors you want to utilize, I like to say, you don't know what you don't know. But for cloud-based VOD transcoding, we know what you don't know because we've been through it, right? And scaling up to power mission critical workflows at massive scale, we've taken it on the chin over the years, outages and this, that, and the other. And so today, for example, we have great redundancies and failover processes in place if a specific data center goes down, things of that nature. And we've now processed over 1 billion videos. We're ingesting 1 trillion API requests a year now, and have powered tens of thousands of workflows. So when looking to partner or looking for a vendor, I think, don't minimize, the experience factor.
All good tips and great information about, like we said, some movement to the cloud that's been coming for a long time, but we're finally seeing come to fruition. So thank you very much, Jeff. Steve put your contact information in the chat as well. So if you want to get in touch with Jeff, you can do that there. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.